There's almost certainly no one right way to die, and the pieces that might work together to become a good death have been described in very different ways across cultures and belief systems. Still, there could be a best way or a preferred way to die for each of us individually. And even figuring that out takes some effort and attention. This presentation provides a framework for looking deeply into the components and dynamics of a good death. While an amazing range of answers may all be correct, the questions are surprisingly finite and consistent. There can be many steps along the way to a final onset. We can be made aware of terminal diseases decades before death occurs. The final onset is easier to recognize in retrospect. The time between when you know you are facing a certain and specific death and the actual end of life. Speed of onset has to be the first variable to look at in considering a good death. Because in sudden death, for example, all the other dimensions are irrelevant, or at least much less relevant. Sudden and unexpected death was introduced earlier, during the saying goodbye topic, to dramatize the idea of no satisfying closure. Here, let's think about it just from a quality of death perspective. People who are not consciously in the dying process tend to say they'd prefer a quick and easy death. A sudden heart attack is a common, barely articulated fantasy, as is just not waking up. Almost everything we think we know about heart disease comes from the Framingham Heart Study, launched back in 1948. What are the mechanisms, the risk factors? How many die suddenly? In the Framingham Heart Study, sudden death is death that occurs less than 1 hour from symptom onset. How many will be sudden? This is where it all depends. The trouble is, some of the things you can do to increase your chance of sudden cardiac arrest and the quick and easy style of good death may not be the way you want to live. Smoking, for instance, that really helps. Being depressed helps too. Dr. Edwin Schneidman is a learned professor of death, or thanatology as it is properly called, so we can assume that his ideas about a good death have a lot of serious thought behind them. Here is what he has published as his top criteria for a good death. First, he dismisses the quick and easy scenario, accidents, suicides, and homicides, and describes his preference for what he calls a natural death. Next, he breaks down the whole time frame consideration into its most fundamentally important parts. Time frame also involves where a good death is located in the human lifespan, and Schneidman is very specific about this, dying at a mature age, which means after 70, 70. Finally, he expands on what he values about the natural, not quick, accidental death: expectedness. He wants some time, and he's willing to name a number. 7 days, about a week's lead time. 7-day onset is his idea of optimal. There's 7 more criteria on Schneidman's list, and they're all important, but these 3 are gating criteria, without which the remaining factors may not even come into play. These 3 set the parameters in which everything else can happen, or not. So let's use them. You're 70. You just learned you have about a week to live, assuming, of course, an accident, suicide, or homicide doesn't intervene. Now what? What are the important pieces of the dying process that we can think about and prepare for, try to make sure we get something close to what we had in mind? We won't touch every base, and there's probably some questions that don't even fit into these categories, but let's start taking a look inside and think about what might contribute to a good death.